Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 121 Luoning. For eyes, are you fucking deaf? The militant who warned before yelled when he saw that Fu Xietain still didn't get off the pickup truck and stepped forward. If you don't get off the damn car in 5 seconds, I'll fill you with holes and feed you to the pigs. Fu Xietain finally reacted and quickly got off the vehicle. Being pointed at by such a weapon, his legs trembled and his face turned pale with fear. This was a Type 79 submachine gun. It was a completely different gun compared to the Type 54 pistol with which the militants assaulted them yesterday. Move. Xietain whispered softly and walked forward, followed closely by the other two. Damn, wasting our time. The militant from before grumbled again before looking the three up and down with a frown. Where did you three come from? What are you coming to this place to do? This territory belongs to the 4 big bosses. Fu Xietain looked at Xietain subtly before he began to explain, stammering, "We 3 are survivors from Beijing University. We escaped by fortune a few days ago and went into hiding." The reason Xietain made Fu Xietain speak was precisely because of the nerves he felt. The militants could tell something was wrong if he or Zhongde spoke too much. After all, neither of them was actors and were too calm by nature. As Fu Xietain answered questions, Xietain scanned the surroundings subtly and was secretly surprised. The wooden fences were useless for defending the village, as a single evolved beast could easily tear them out of the ground. However, for normal low-level zombies that had no strength, these wooden fences were a major obstacle that could buy some time for the survivors. In the streets, there were occasional people passing by wearing somewhat dirty and tattered clothes. The expressions of almost everyone were dark and their eyes glittered with fear as they cautiously looked around. Most people were sitting outside their homes, staring at nothing with dead faces. Occasionally, someone would squirm on the ground clutching their stomach hungrily, which was a clear sign that all these people had eaten too little or even nothing for quite some time. "Hey! What are you bringing inside that bag?" The other militant seemed to be bored when he noticed the plastic bag in Xietain's hands and immediately inquired loudly. Xietain looked at the militant and tried to put on a scared expression, which failed miserably. In the end, in order not to cause any problems, he simply opened the bag quietly and showed the contents. "Damn, is this guy mute or something?" The second militant muttered and casually looked inside the bag without much expectation. However, when he and his buddy saw the small bag with rice and the milk carton, their eyes lit up. The first militant grabbed the small bag of rice and weighed it with his hand casually before exclaiming, "Damn it. It is more than 200 grams of white rice." The second militant also looked surprised and snatched the bag of rice from him to check it by himself. In the camp, supplies were tightly controlled by the strongest of the 4 bosses, Xietain. Normally, a person who did not work could only eat some rice made into mush diluted with water to form something similar to gruel but consisting mainly of water. Except for the militants with guns who went out to risk their lives to fetch supplies, everyone inside the village was slowly starving to death. The 4 bosses obviously had no idea how to lead so many people, as they did not even delegate jobs to give the village some brightness and order. Even for these 2 militants guarding the entrance, 500 grams of rice was small wealth. Working all day standing guard, they could at most earn 40 grams of rice each. Xietain's eyes glittered coldly. Although he already expected something like this, the brazen robbery still upset him. For the past half-month, no one had dared to speak to him in such a tone, let alone try to steal from him, so naturally, his patience was wearing thin. But he endured and said nothing. The militants looked at each other before looking at the 3 of them. The first militant to speak said in a deep voice, "As we are magnanimous, we will not examine your belongings, and you can leave with that milk carton. As a token of kindness, let me tell you that west of town there are a few free houses still, you can use those." Without waiting for a reply, the other militant waved his hand impatiently, "Hurry up and get out of here, you smell really gross." Zhongde looked at them coldly, but seeing Xietain subtly shaking his head, he finally looked down. The 3 of them walked into the village slowly, listening to the gloating laughter of the militants. "Big brother why don't we just explode their heads and take over their guns?" Zhongde clenched his fists and cursed under his breath, "Damn those 2 dogs. A single blow from my fists is enough to make their heads explode into meat pulp, but they dare to treat us like puppies?" Xietain laughed coldly and replied as he walked towards the south of the village, "Don't worry. When we get control of this whole place, I'll see to it that they spit out those 500 grams of rice completely, even if I have to make them work as mules." Considering the rations they had, 500 grams of rice could not be considered too much. However, no one would feel good if they were robbed and then acted as if nothing had happened, let alone Xietain, who was slowly getting used to being in a position of power. The village was not very large, and in the past, only about 60 or 70 families lived there. However, due to the search for supplies carried out periodically by the four bosses, the number of survivors had increased exponentially, so that makeshift huts had to be built. Xietain and the rest saw how a group of young children between 8 and 14 years old ran barefoot everywhere. They were all looking for small bugs that had not yet begun to mutate or tree bark to fill their empty stomachs. As the world changed, these children were also forced to change and leave their innocence behind to adapt to the new rules if they wanted to survive. After walking for about 5 minutes, the group of 3 stopped in front of an ordinary-looking small house. The door was firmly closed, but from outside they could hear a sweet voice singing like a happy bird coming from inside, which was a sharp contrast to the scene outside. When Xietain knocked softly on the wooden door and took a step back, the singing stopped and a sweet childish voice rang out, "1 second please." A moment later, the door opened and the head of a little girl peeked out, who immediately looked at them with her big eyes filled with curiosity. Hello. My name is Luoning. May I know what do you need? Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 122, 3 Big Bosses. Xietain looked at the girl in front of him with the same degree of curiosity she seemed to feel as she looked at them. She was small, her body thin and petite without any sign of maturity, which was completely normal, considering she was only 9 years old. Her hair was as black as ink and her face extremely pretty, like that of a porcelain doll. But the most striking thing was her eyes. On the way here, Xietain had seen other children and easily noticed that they all had cunning looks as they scanned the surroundings, like little foxes waiting for the perfect opportunity to launch an assault. However, the eyes of the little girl in front of him were like 2 shining gems free of any impurity. It was as if even when the outside world had turned into hell, it was incapable of staining her heart. Just as she was happily singing a few moments ago inside the small house, it was as if the inside and outside were different dimensions. Apparently, that Luocheng guy did a good job taking care of his little sister. Xietain silently analyzed as he crouched down to be at the girl's level. "You are Luoning? My name is Xietain, and these 2 are my friends Fu Xiefeng and Zhongde." Xietain smiled for the first time in a long time, a real smile and not a fake or forced one. "Your big brother's name is Luocheng, isn't it?" Luoning's eyes shone with a hint of caution, and she unconsciously stepped back slightly before cautiously asking, "Elder brothers, you are people sent by the 4 big village bosses?" "My big brother left yesterday morning, but he still hasn't returned." So, seeing the girl's weariness, Xietain took out the milk carton and held it forward as he said, "Actually, we are friends with your brother Luocheng. We met yesterday a few kilometers from here and we get along well." "Oh." The girl looked at the milk carton and swallowed softly. She obviously wanted it but still shook her head. "Elder brother, where is my brother?" Xietain didn't insist and gave the milk carton to Zhongde to look after before saying, "I'll take you to him tonight if you want. For now, how about giving me a walk around? I'd like to get to know the village more, if you're not too busy." Luoning hesitated as she had heard her big brother Luocheng told her not to leave the house without him present. But it had been more than a day since he had left and there had been no news from him, so she was worried. After all, without her big brother she would not be able to survive alone in this world, since he was her only source of dependability. Besides, she somehow knew that the person in front of her would not hurt her. As for how such a thing was possible when she had just met him, it was unknown. "Okay. Luoning will take you for a walk." She closed the door and locked it with a small key she took out of her pocket before taking Xietan's hand with a sweet smile. The girl didn't seem to mind the smell on his body and didn't seem to be on guard either as she started walking, pulling Xietan's hand while pointing out some places. "That's the place where the village fighters gather every day before going out to look for supplies or people. This is where Boss Lei Su lives. Big brother, don't tell anyone, but actually Boss Lei Su is a pervert with more than 10 wives. This is the village square, and the bosses often gather the other survivors to give orders. It is also used as a gathering point every night where a big pot of food is made and distributed to the survivors. Bai Zemin walked hand in hand with Luo Ning, and the girl enthusiastically introduced the main places of the village. Her cheerful and lively attitude attracted a lot of attention, as there were often survivors turning to look at her in astonishment, as if they could not believe that in such chaos there was a person who could act in such a way. Even Bai Zemin had unconsciously relaxed, feeling the tension on his body ease. Luo Ning caused that Bai Zemin unconsciously thought on his little sister Meng Qi, so the girl had really started to like him. Following them from behind, Fu Xiefeng and Zhong De were secretly surprised, as this was the first time they had seen the normally cold and cruel Bai Zemin have such a gentle expression on his face. Meanwhile, in the most luxurious villa of the village, an important discussion was taking place amidst a dark and heavy atmosphere. Sitting on a couch and enjoying the tender hands of a woman massaging his shoulders, a burly man of about 35 years old had a grim expression on his scarred face. This man was actually Yi Qigong, the strongest of the 4 camp leaders, as well as the man with the most authority. On another couch, to Yi Qigong's right, a middle-aged man was enjoying touching the breasts of 2 pretty women who had barely entered their 30s. His appearance was quite decent in comparison to Yi Qigong's deformed face. However, the truth was that this man was actually cruel and sadistic. This man was Lei Su, and it was said that more than 3 women had already died at his hands because they could not tolerate his games in bed. At the left, on another small couch, a man between 25 and 30 years old with a monkey-like appearance was constantly looking around with cautious eyes. He was the only one without a woman accompanying him. This man was the 3rd village boss, Du Meng. What about Yang Pei? Lei Su casually asked as he continued to caress the 2 women's breasts. A strange smile formed on his lips, and he laughed rampantly. That idiot couldn't have amused himself with some booty? Ha ha ha. Du Meng looked at him without saying anything, and his eyes glittered strangely. I don't think that's it. Yi Qigong ignored Lei Su's jokes and shook his head. Although Lei Su was a bit perverted and somewhat crazy, he was brave and could fight well, so Yi Qigong tolerated him to the extent possible. I have a bad feeling. Yi Qigong muttered, and the room went silent immediately. Even Lei Su stopped playing and his expression changed slightly. In the past, Yi Qigong had had several bad feelings, and it was thanks to this that the 3 of them along with Yang Pei had managed to escape trouble. Even when the soul record came to Earth, it was thanks to Yi Qigong that the 3 of them were able to survive. Therefore, every time something happened, Lei Su and Du Meng knew that it was no time for jokes. Yi Qigong waved his hand and the woman behind him stopped massaging him. He stood up and said in a deep voice, Du Meng, prepare your men and scout the surrounding areas, but don't go too far away. Lei Su, take 20 men and go up north. It is possible that Yang Pei has encountered problems, and if that's the case, he might need help. Du Meng stood up without a word and went out the front door. As for Lei Su, he licked his lips and ran out anxiously, since every time he went out, if he found some pretty woman he could have fun first. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 123. Chen He's determination and Lei Su's death. As they walked through the streets of the village, Bai Zemin noticed that little Luo Ning often looked back before quickly turning her eyes forward. At first, he was confused by the girl's behavior, but soon understood and could not help but laugh lightly. Zhong De, give that to the little girl. Bai Zemin stopped his steps and gestured backwards. Zhong De chuckled as he too had seen Luo Ning's eyes fixed on the milk carton, so he took a step forward and gave it to her. Luo Ning blushed but took the milk carton. She nodded prettily and thanked him softly, thank you. Although Luo Qing had taken care of her to the best of his ability, with the change in the world it was impossible for Luo Ning's life to go back to the way it was before. With the daily payment that Luo Qing received, she could eat enough rice to not feel hungry and also had access to some vegetables, but things like meat or luxuries like milk were not something he, a normal militant, could access. In the past, drinking a milk carton during breakfast or break time at school was normal, but Luo Ning had almost forgotten the taste after half a month of not even seeing a carton. Seeing the girl drinking with enthusiasm, the passing survivors looked at her with envy. Most of them were starving, so Luo Ning's situation was too good in comparison. Because this place was very close to the village square, the number of people was quite large as everyone was eagerly and hopefully waiting for the bosses to recruit men. With guns, most of them were willing to fight, and even more so when the reward was food. Most of them were willing to do anything for food as the rations were not enough. Suddenly, the crowd became agitated as several armed men appeared running with a small man in the lead. "That's Boss Du Meng," Luo Ning whispered softly and held on to Bai Zemin's hand as she said, "My big brother told me that he is the most mysterious of the 4 bosses, as he usually never speaks. But it is said that he is very fast, like a ghost that appears and disappears." Bai Zemin nodded silently and gently squeezed her small hand in. "Thanks for the information." He narrowed his eyes as he hid in the crowd of survivors and observed Du Meng carefully. "Everyone. Starting today, a curfew will be put in place until further notice for everyone's safety." Du Meng shouted loudly. His voice was similar to 2 sandpapers clashing together, extremely uncomfortable to listen to. "Today's meal will now be served and everyone will return in an orderly fashion to their homes." The survivors looked at each other in confusion. It was barely after 10 o'clock in the morning, but they already had to return to their homes? Although some had complaints, none dared voice them and they nodded obediently. After all, for such measures to be implemented there were probably serious problems. Besides, no survivor had the courage to oppose the 4 village bosses. Those who had the courage had already been beheaded or cut into pieces and thrown into the pigs to be eaten. Du Meng nodded to himself as he heard no strange whispers and waved his hand. Behind him, a group of people came out carrying several carts and other cooking utensils along with a huge pot. One militant stepped forward and shouted loudly, "Line up to get today's food. Whoever does not obey or does not line up orderly will be thrown to the zombies." The survivors trembled in fear upon hearing the threat and began to line up orderly with their heads down. Even Luo Ning was scared and unconsciously clung to Bai Zemin's arm tightly. As the survivors received their rations, which were basically a few grains of rice with water and nothing else, the sound of several engines roaring in the distance attracted everyone's attention. 2 buses, 2 trucks, and 4 pickup trucks sped past, disappearing in a short time in the direction of the exit. The survivors panicked, thinking the zombies were approaching, so they quickly began to eat before rushing to their homes and locking the doors tightly from the inside. Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and looked at the place where the convoy of vehicles had disappeared with a thoughtful look. A few seconds later he ordered, "Let's go." Zhong De and Fu Xiefeng nodded before quickly following Bai Zemin. In the distance, Du Meng narrowed his eyes and looked at the milk carton in Luo Ning's hands. His thoughtful gaze had a strange glint in it before he gave an order to a militant beside him. Bai Zemin raised an eyebrow in surprise but did not stop his steps and continued walking towards the house where Luo Ning and Luo Cheng lived. His lips curved into a cold smile that was impossible to detect. 20 kilometers away from the camp, Chen He was lying on the roof of a building. In his hands was a pair of binoculars they had taken the day before from the militants, looking off into the distance with a grave expression. Several hundred meters away, a convoy of vehicles that had barely been modified was rapidly approaching, raising a cloud of dust behind them like a wild beast. "It's Lei Su!" Luo Cheng exclaimed in a grim voice, his body in the same position as Chen He and holding a pair of binoculars. "That man in front is one of the 3 camp bosses, Lei Su. He is even stronger than Yang Pei and bullets can't penetrate his defenses when he activates his steel armor skill." Lei Su was sitting in the passenger seat in one of the pickup trucks leading the way. Chen He could even see through the binoculars a wild smile filled with arrogance as if he was not worried about anything in the world. Chen He could not help but remember when at the beginning of the apocalypse Bai Zemin told him that his attitude would not only end up killing him, but would also end up hurting those he loved because of his insecurity. Every militant was armed and there were at least 20 men inside the different vehicles. If they continued on this path would definitely reach the hotel where the group was currently staying, and with so many people it would be impossible not to be noticed unless they were given time to hide, something which considering the situation they lacked. The problem had arisen from the fact that none of them had expected the main leader Yi Qigong to be so cunning and clever, which made things difficult up to this point. Chen He sighed and pulled out the Type 54 pistol from his waist. "So, if he doesn't activate his skill, that fellow is no big deal, isn't he?" Luo Cheng lowered the binoculars and looked at him in surprise. "Yeah, well. No matter what, Lei Su is still just a human, just like us. Then it's okay. Chen, he nodded and aimed forward. 300 meters. 200 meters. 150 meters. Chen, he sighed to himself and whispered, "Don't blame me, I have no choice but to do it." Then, with a look brimming conviction, he pulled the trigger without hesitation. Ha 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 ha. Lei Su laughed jovially and tapped the board of the vehicle. In his mind, he was already imagining the scene of him having fun with several beautiful women and thinking about what kind of games he should try this time. The eyes of the militant driving the pickup truck flashed with disgust, but he didn't dare to show it openly and continued driving silently. Bang! Suddenly there was a sound of gunfire from the front and the front window of the vehicle cracked. But the militant driving was more concerned about the hot liquid that had splashed on his right cheek out of nowhere. The militant looked out of the corner of his eyes in a split second and his face turned white as a sheet at what he saw. Lei Su, who was laughing like crazy a second ago, had a bullet hole right in the middle of his forehead. Blood ran down his face uncontrollably and his expression had frozen while his lifeless eyes were wide open, filled with disbelief even in the face of death. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 124, Confrontation. Shit. The driver of the pickup truck leading the convoy's path panicked and pushed on the brakes with a thump. The wheels of the pickup truck stopped immediately, but the vehicle continued to move forward due to the remaining momentum. The rear end swayed as the sound of the braking thundered through the clearing. The vehicles behind also heard the gunshot, and upon seeing the lead vehicle come to an abrupt stop, the drivers also pushed hard on the brakes. The sound of braking echoed everywhere, and some vehicles that did not have a great distance with the vehicle in front crashed noisily into each other. The street that had been silent several days ago, when humans were hiding from the zombies, had suddenly become noisy and chaotic like a movie scene. Dead. Boss Lei Su died. The militant in the first pickup truck got out in panic and started screaming in alarm as he crouched behind the vehicle, looking around in fear. The militants were frightened when they heard the gunshot, but upon hearing the news of the death of the main leader in this team, they all began to panic. A sniper! Take cover quickly! Damn it! Even Boss Lei Su was killed, how are we supposed to survive? Clutching their guns, the militants began yelling as they were shooting at the buildings in front of them. Although none of them knew where the sniper was, they had heard roughly where the shot came from. With more than 20 men firing, the bullets seemed like a golden storm of metal hitting and destroying everything in their path. The windows of some houses or buildings were shattered into pieces, walls were filled with small holes, some vehicles were turned into sieves, etc. Type 89 submachine gun, Type 81 rifle, Type 54 pistol, etc. All kinds of guns were fired uncontrollably, wasting ammunition recklessly to shake off the fear of the unknown. From the top of a building just over 100 meters away, Chen, he and Luo Cheng sought cover while looking at the development with surprise. What happened? Chen, he asked aloud. His face was pale as a sheet due to his first kill, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him alert. He did not expect that just one shot would be enough to make the enemy group, which consisted of more than 20 men armed with all kinds of firearms and enough ammunition to wipe out the entire group of survivors in the hotel, collapse so easily. Chen He had only 2 Type 54 pistols with 15 rounds of ammunition in total, one of which had already been used to kill Lei Su before. He was preparing to fight to the death, but apparently, it was not necessary. Although they all have guns, they are not soldiers with military training. Luo Cheng pointed out with a bitter smile. Because of the gunfire, he also had to raise his voice. Each of them in the past was a farmer, businessman, journalist, and who knows what else. But when the apocalypse broke out, only by having a gun could they feel safe. The 4 bosses had recruited more than 50 men and armed them after raiding the police station near the village. These militants could fight zombies because they were slow, and with guns, they didn't need to get close to them at the risk of being infected. However, when facing other humans it was different. Especially when the enemy was able to kill one of the bosses so easily. With his sniper skill, Chen He's marksmanship was terrifying to the point where he was confident to hit a zombie in the head even from 200 meters away with a pistol. However, due to the lack of a suitable weapon, he had not been able to show his strength properly in the first 2 weeks of the apocalypse. However, as his weaponry improved, he would naturally become more powerful. Enemy, fire! Suddenly the militants roared and began to shoot all in the same direction. When Chen He looked towards the spot, he realized in fright that Shangguan Bing Shui was running in irregular patterns, dodging bullets while taking cover from different obstacles along the way. Die at once, you fucking monster. A militant had bloodshot eyes as he fired in uninterrupted bursts. The fear of the unknown and seeing the enemy's ghostly speed was driving him insane. Swoosh, Shangguan Bing Shui shot out from her hiding place and waved her hand. An ice spike flew through the air under her control and struck the militant in the chest, killing him immediately and freezing the wound firmly. Although she was fast and the militants could barely aim properly as she moved relentlessly, it was inevitable that a bullet or two would hit her. However, when those bullets did hit her, they were stopped by her combat dress rare-grade treasure. It was precisely because of this treasure that she dared to charge into a hail of bullets. Otherwise, even she would not be crazy enough to do something that could definitely cost her life. Chen He gritted his teeth and raised the Type 54 pistol, aiming at a militant who seemed to have lost his sanity. With an extra bang sound, the militant's brains were sent flying and stained the ground, creating a bloody mess. Immediately after, a hail of bullets was directed in his direction as he had been caught, forcing him into a passive position where he dared not raise his head casually. Although he too was quick and his aim terrifying, a shot in the head would give him the same fate suffered by Lei Su earlier. With the target now clear, the militants began to calm down a bit, and one of them seemed to take the temporary lead as bullets began to be used wisely. Instead of firing relentlessly, steady bursts began to be fired every few seconds. Although the saving of ammunition was obvious, the pressure on the enemy would also become less strong as a consequence. Besides, even so, the ammunition would soon run out. After all, although Lei Su was one of the bosses, he could not bring too much with him, and they only had about 2,000 ammunition in a total, of which more than 500 had been wasted when the battle broke out. Shangguan Bing Shui continued to dodge between the buildings and cars, constantly throwing weapons created with her ice maker skill at the enemy. After 5 minutes, she had already claimed the lives of 10 militants, but even then her face remained impassive. Because she attracted the most attention, Chen He had managed to take out 2 other militants, but in an oversight was shot in the arm. Seeing Shangguan Bing Shui charging like an unstoppable killing machine, the 5 militants on their feet knew they could not stop her, so they immediately threw their weapons to the ground and knelt down. We surrender. We are surrendering. Don't kill me. We were just following orders to survive. None of them wanted to die. It was in the DNA genetics of every living being. Therefore, seeing Shangguan Bing Shui being immune to bullets, using terrifying skills, and her frightening speed, the remaining militants seemed to wake up and without hesitation surrendered. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 125 Massacre, Part 1. Shangguan Bing Shui also did not continue massacring and reduced the 5 unarmed militants with ease. Soon after, Kong Lan and Kai Jingyi appeared on the scene. As the only healer, Kong Lan used her skill on Chen He's wounded arm once. As for the second time, she did not dare to use it in case Bai Zemin or someone else needed help. No one said anything regarding this, and Chen He thanked her with a polite smile, to which she responded by nodding calmly. As for Kai Jingyi, she along with Shangguan Bing Shui and Luo Cheng were asking questions to the 5 militants who had been tied with strings tightly. After all, the convoy's appearance had been too sudden and everyone assumed that Bai Zemin might have encountered some problems. Unfortunately, the only one who might know something about it was Lei Su, but his head had already been exploded by Chen He even before the battle fully erupted. Fortunately, just when Shangguan Bing Shui was about to suggest charging into the village and taking advantage of the fact that the enemy forces had been weakened, Fu Xiefeng appeared like a ghost in front of everyone before anyone noticed. Big Brother Bai also doesn't know why there was such a big move suddenly. Fu Xiefeng looked at Shangguan Bing Shui and shook his head before saying confidently, however, he sent me to say that tonight the village will be conquered by him. Do he need us to do anything? Chen He asked with a slight grimace of pain. Although the wound had stopped bleeding, it was still there and the pain persisted. This was the first time he had ever been shot or found himself in a crossfire with other humans, so fear still struck his heart. Fu Xiefeng looked at him and said with a mocking smile, Big Brother Bai said that you just have to block the exit of the village. He will take care of cleaning up the trash. Kai Jingyi nodded and said confidently, with his strength, he can easily take care of the whole village. Even if it's 30 armed men. Kong Lan looked at her and chuckled under her breath, although your statement is quite bold considering it's 30 machine guns and other guns against one unarmed human being. I can't find words to refute what you said. Shangguan Bingshui looked at the two girls and shook her head. Let's prepare just in case. The chatter stopped and everyone began to prepare in case Bai Zemin needed help. Fu Xiefeng could easily return to the village unnoticed using his stealth skill, but Bai Zemin had told him that it wasn't necessary, so he decided to stay and help out here. Back at the four big bosses' camp, Bai Zemin was looking over the house where Luo Ning and Luo Qing had been living. It was a normal house, had 2 rooms, a living room that also functioned as a dining room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Although it didn't have many luxuries and the TV channels were dead, everything was properly tidy and it was hard to find even a speck of dust on the furniture. Luo Ning, you keep this place clean all by yourself? Bai Zemin looked at her as she wiped a flannel cloth on the wooden table and couldn't help but let his eyes light up with a hint of praise. The girl nodded happily and replied while humming a nursery rhyme, Big Brother is too busy killing zombies, so I cook what I can and clean the house too. I have nothing to do anyway, and going out is dangerous, so at least I can entertain myself like this. That's quite admirable for a girl your age. Bai Zemin stood up and began to help the girl as they chatted about casual matters. Suddenly, he felt it was a regret that he hadn't brought more things with him or asked Fu Xiefeng to bring some cakes when brought his sword today. As night fell, Luo Ning prepared the dinner. Although it was actually simple. She looked at the white rice with half a sausage in Bai Zemin's bowl and lowered her head as she whispered softly, Elder brother, I'm so sorry. Currently, our family only has this. Actually, a meal with some meat was very luxurious and the sausage that Luo Ning had cooked was a rarity that Luo Qing had obtained only because he discovered a storage cellar with provisions in the past and the 4 bosses generously rewarded him. That sausage was the best she could make at present and usually she only ate rice with some bread. Bai Zemin looked at the food on the table and his eyes had a complicated glint in them. For the past 2 weeks, he had eaten like a king. Meat, fish, vegetables, legumes. Basically, he had everything he would like to have. However, it was only when he saw the bowl in front of him that he really realized how lucky he was. Don't worry, little girl. He smiled softly and as he put the white rice in his mouth, he replied, my family didn't have much money before either, so eating rice or noodles alone was an occasional occurrence. He wasn't lying. He really wasn't picky about food. It was just that sometimes one needed a small reminder in the present so as not to forget the past. Seeing him eat without any displeasure or discomfort, the girl sighed and giggled happily before she began to eat joyfully. The current Bai Zemin had already showered and Luo Ning had given him some of Luo Qing's clothes, so he did not feel uncomfortable. Under such an atmosphere, the two ate while occasionally saying a few words. As for Zhongde, he had another mission currently, so he was not present. Unfortunately, all good things had to come to an end. Even more so in this new apocalyptic world. Blood will, 1.2%/50%. Bai Zemin lowered his chopsticks softly and looked out the window. However, all he saw was darkness. Just in time. I really need to release some frustration. He muttered under his breath. Eh? Luo Ning looked at him and tilted her head in confusion. Did you say something? He stood up and under the girl's confused eyes, he whispered, sleep for now, little Luo Ning. When you wake up, I'll let you eat as much as you want until you go with a happy smile to bed. Before the little girl could respond, Bai Zemin pressed a specific point on her neck and she closed her eyes, falling unconscious seconds later. His Special Forces soldier skill was truly incredible, as it had a lot of knowledge about different martial arts and about the human body. Therefore, it was easy for him to put a person to sleep without hurting her in any way. Not even 2 seconds later, a dozen machine guns started firing from the outside to the inside. The wooden door was shattered, the windows destroyed, and everything inside the house was riddled with bullets. 4 militants appeared at the windows with grenades in their hands. After removing the safety catch, they threw them inside without any hesitation. Bang! 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 The grenades exploded like thunder in the middle of the night, and the small house collapsed completely after losing the support of several steel beams. Just as the militants stopped firing at the sight of the destruction, a shadow shot out like a whirlwind from within the cloud of dust and the pile of rubble. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 126 Massacre, Part 2 Last. A militant signaled and the shooting stopped immediately. Looking at the collapsed house turned into rubble covered by a thick cloud of dust rising into the night sky, he sneered. Heh. Although I don't understand why Boss Du Ming ordered us to kill that girl and that brat, it really is a waste of ammunition and grenades. The amount of ammunition the four bosses had managed to obtain after raiding the local police station had been about 20,000 rounds along with a few grenades. However, after the constant confrontation against the zombies and the constant raids in search of resources, the arsenal had been greatly reduced and now there were just over 10,000 rounds of ammunition. After all, while it was true that zombies were slow and a shot in the head meant death, the militants were not soldiers with military training, they were just a random mafia gathering to fight. It was absolutely and utterly impossible that the militants, most of whom had never fired a gun before, could hit every shot. In fact, 99% of the time the bullets missed their target or hit other parts of the zombies' bodies, and only 1% of the time did a bullet hit the brain accurately. Therefore, the waste of ammunition was incredibly high. It was precisely for this reason that the militants did not understand why Du Ming had sent more than a dozen gunmen and even grenades to a little girl's house. Bang! Suddenly, the dust burst open and rubble flew everywhere. The militants panicked and quickly raised their guns again, but all they saw was a sharp flash of light shining in the middle of the starless night. The militant who had previously spoken felt his world spinning and was shocked to see his body standing headless with blood gushing from his neck. His life was completely over even before his head touched the ground. Right behind the corpse, Xietain was holding his immaculate Xianyuan sword in his right hand. In his embrace and resting on his left arm, little Luo Ning, who was only 9 years old, was sleeping soundly like a little angel. Even after the earlier shooting, the explosions of 4 grenades, and the collapse of the house, both Xietain and Luo Ning were unscathed, and not even a fleck of dust had touched their bodies. How scumbag do you have to be to target a little girl? His cold voice rang out in the middle of the night and his indifferent eyes were demon-like from the militant's point of view. Holy SHF fire! A militant roared in fright and everyone began to shoot in a hurry. The muzzles of the Type 79 submachine guns spat bullet after bullet relentlessly in the direction of the 2 young people. No militant seemed concerned about the little girl or even the young man who was old enough to be the son of some of them. To survive such an earlier assault, it was obvious that the young man was not normal. Also, as a reminder, the militant's head and body in a pool of blood reminded them of a possible fate that none of them wanted to experience. Swoosh! The broken bronze bell flew out of Xietan's pocket and hovered over his head. Before the bullets could reach him, a thin yellow membrane surrounded him and consequently little Luo Ning as well. Bang! 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 The bullets hit the thin magic barrier and sparks flew everywhere. However, to the horror of the militants, all the bullets were easily repelled and the barrier did not even flinch. In fact, the barrier had weakened after being fiercely shaken by 4 grenades at such close range. However, it still had enough power to withstand normal bullets without any problem. D-damn monster! Kill him! Another militant roared and shouted as he fired with bloodshot eyes. When he exhausted his magazine, scared he began to search for the second one in his clothes with trembling hands. However, before he could change magazines, Xietain appeared before him and slashed horizontally. The militant's body was cut off at the waist and his organs flew everywhere along with streams of hot blood. Because he had not yet died, the militant felt the most dreadful pain he had ever felt or imagined in his entire life. Arg! It hurts. Kill me. Please kill me, he pleaded between cries that terrified his comrades. Xietain ignored him and let him suffer until the last moment. His leg muscles swelled and with a loud bang the ground beneath his feet exploded as he disappeared from his position and appeared in front of another militant, slashing horizontally without mercy. Just as before, the militant let out a cry that seemed to come from deep within his soul as he fell to the ground cut in 2 halves. Monster! Run away! Pete, please don't kill me. We were just following orders to survive. Arg. Xietain defied the rain of bullets with a cold gaze and like a demon reaped the lives of his enemies one by one. No matter how many times the militants pleaded, none of them received even a shred of his mercy and were cut in two. Mercy? Compassion? Was he really a monster? It was clear to Xietain that he had committed many cruel things since the apocalypse erupted with the arrival of the soul record on Earth. However, even he had limits. He did not force himself on any woman, he did not unjustly mistreat anyone to release his frustrations or fears, nor did he abuse children. However, the militants in front of him were so cruel that even knowing that they were going to kill a girl as young as 9 years old, they did not even hesitate. They didn't even know if she had done anything evil, but as they received the order and in order to live more comfortably, without hesitation they raised their guns and threw grenades into the house of a defenseless girl. Who was the monster really? Xietain believed that, at least in this case, he was not the bad guy. A few seconds later, the sounds of gunshots and pleading cries had completely stopped. The ground 100 meters around the now collapsed small house had become a bloody mess. 12 decapitated corpses, cut from the waist down, lay in disarray as they bathed in their own still-warm blood. Blood will, 12%/50%. Xietain was standing surrounded by corpses. Regardless of whether he looked left or right, all his dark eyes saw was crimson red along with the reflection of the full moon in the pools of blood. His sword, his clothes, his body or Luo Ning's, everything was in perfect condition in contrast to the situation around them. Let's get this over with and then go to sleep. Xietain looked in the direction of the village center and his eyes flashed coldly. With steady steps, his lonely back soon disappeared into the surrounding trees. Behind him, 12 lifeless people and the destruction of the surroundings were the only proof of what had happened here. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 127. Yi Qigong. Inside the villa where Yi Qigong resided, he and Du Meng were standing together in front of the window as if they were appreciating the full moon high in the sky surrounded by thick dark clouds. Yi Qigong frowned and asked in a deep voice that only when he was worried about something he used, "Are you sure about what you said?" Today in the afternoon, and after delegating approximately 20 men to protect specific checkpoints that would facilitate the defense of the central area of the village in the direction of the mansion, Du Meng arrived at this place and told Yi Qigong that he might have found the source of his anxiety. Du Meng was a quiet man and rarely said anything except when it was necessary. Therefore, Yi Qigong did not believe that he was joking or saying things without an important purpose or something to rely on. "I'm sure." Du Meng nodded. His rough but at the same time sharp voice was extremely strange and unpleasant to listen to. That little girl had a milk carton in her hand. Where would a 9-year-old girl get something as valuable as milk from? Indeed. That's strange. Yi Qigong nodded. Milk was a luxury these days, and even he himself couldn't drink it every day at will, let alone a 9-year-old girl who couldn't even fend for herself. Du Meng continued, "After asking some men, I found out that this girl is actually the younger sister of Luo Cheng, one of our armed men. If the milk was stolen by him, then the girl's death will be a punishment in the form of a warning. But if the milk was brought from outside by those 2 unknown young men, then they should be dead in no time." Yi Qigong was silent before nodding appreciatively. Du Meng's words were cruel, but none of them were good men to begin with. Even before the arrival of the soul record, they had already committed several crimes and even killed some people. The sound of gunshots and explosions in the distance soon reached here, and the two looked at each other. A few seconds later, the sound stopped and all was silent again. They should be dead, Du Meng concluded. However, Yi Qigong shook his head and frowned. "Du Meng, you left someone guarding the arsenal of weapons and ammunition? Only 2 men since the rest left with Lei Su and Yang Pei. Besides, the rest are. Fuck." Du Meng suddenly realized something and cursed before dashing towards the exit at full speed. Yi Qigong took a deep breath and soon heard the sound of gunshots in the distance, getting closer and closer. His eyes flashed coldly and he turned around, walking towards the exit, releasing an aura of murderous intent. Reaching the back, he approached a pile of junk cars and touched them while activating his metal control skill. Soon, the metal of the cars moved strangely, and as if it had life, it began to surround him completely. In a matter of seconds, Xietain had turned into a steel giant that was over 3 meters tall. Without saying a single word, he proceeded to walk with heavy steps towards the main gate of the villa. On his way through the village, Xietain did not meet any resistance. The survivors were trembling with fear and had locked themselves in their houses while clutching their heads or hugging each other. The sound of gunshots, the cries of pain, and the 4 explosions followed by the collapse of something of considerable size had scared everyone so that no one dared to even poke his head out of the window. From the moment the 4 bosses arrived in the village and took control, all the survivors knew that life at this point was worth less than a piece of stale bread and anyone could kill without too much consequence. After all, considering the situation in the outside world, who was going to punish a murderer? On the contrary, it was likely that such a killer would be accepted among the militants for daring to fight instead of being punished. Therefore, no one even dared to squeak and they remained silent, praying to God for their fates. When Xietain reached the center of the village, the first thing that caught his eye was a luxurious 3-story building, surrounded by lights and extremely conspicuous in this place where everyone's lights were off. Although they had not come this far today, little Luoning had told him that the strongest boss lived in the most luxurious house in the center of the village. Therefore, Xietain easily identified it as his main and final target. Blood will, 14%/50%. Bang. 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 The power boost provided by his passive second-order Blood Will skill was triggered by an extra 2% and Xietain didn't even have time to react when a rain of bullets was directed in his direction. From the left, from the right, from the front, and even from behind. Placed at different points, 20 militants with machine guns or pistols fired mercilessly. Even without military training, with 20 machine guns firing at the same time, it was absolutely impossible to miss and not hit the enemy target. Even a fly would be hit by at least a single bullet. However, Xietain continued to walk undisturbed. When the bullets reached him, the broken bronze bell did not fly out of his pocket and the automatic protection effect was not activated. However, the bullets were stopped in midair by a barrier that could not be seen with the naked eye. You can all go to hell. Xietain muttered and the reject ring in his left hand glowed slightly. Swoosh. 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 The militants did not know that all the bullets they were firing had been magically stopped in midair and continued firing, piling up more and more bullets. Before they could react, the bullets that were their allies suddenly turned around and shot out at a speed no slower than before, back at the militants. Aarg, Aya, help me. Amid cries of pain and despair, the militants were hit by at least a dozen shots each in different parts of the body. Arms, legs, abdomen, chest, shoulders, head, heart, etc. Some bullets even curved in the air while searching for the man with the gun that fired them, turning the different militants into sieves filled with holes and covering the ground with blood, brain parts, and even pieces of skull. Blood will, 32%/50%. The gunfire had not even persisted for 3 seconds and the 20 militants had been killed by Xietain without even lifting a finger. Xietain continued to move forward with the sleeping Luoning in his arms until he suddenly stopped when the ground beneath his feet began to shake softly and become heavier and heavier with every second. Soon, he understood the reason. Are you Xietain? The strongest boss in this place? Xietain asked indifferently as he looked at the metal monster that was over 3 meters tall about 100 meters away. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 128 Xietain that cannot be defeated. The giant surrounded by layers and layers of metal looked like a sci-fi robot but with no technology and just pure strength. Its arms were the size of a grown man and its legs were so wide that only 3 people together could wrap their outstretched arms around it. Moreover, just the pressure emitted by its overall size was enough to make most enemies sink in despair. That's me. Xietain heard the voice of a middle-aged man from inside the metal robot. Although it was a human's voice, due to the sheets of metal surrounding it sounded like there were several people inside as the echo rang out all over the place. And who are you? Xietain asked, brimming with murderous intent. Even before the apocalypse, he had never been offended and all those who tried had paid the consequences. After evolving through constantly absorbing soul power and acquiring skills, his self-confidence had become a lot higher. Although he knew that the young man in front of him was strong enough to defeat and kill a group of nearly 50 armed men and even survive the explosion of 4 hand grenades, Xietain had such an ability as well. Me? Xietain stepped forward and coldly replied, the person who took care of a small shrimp named Yang Pei. The person who slaughtered all the men who accompanied him. The strongest fighter in the group that killed the dog by the name of Lei Su. The boss of the man who is currently taking care of that little monkey, Du Meng. But more importantly, the person who will kill you. Xietan's heart shook in a whirlwind of churning emotions when he heard the young man's declaration before him. However, he did not have time to think too much as his passive skill danger sense caused his entire body to tremble in fear, and he unconsciously raised both of his mechanical arms in the shape of a cross covering in front of him. Xietain appeared in front of the giant robot and swung his right fist forward without holding back in the slightest. Boom! Although Xietain had managed to react quickly thanks to his passive skill danger sense and thanks to his own combat experience, even with the protection of layers upon layers of metal he was unable to withstand the power of Xietan's fist boosted 32% by his blood will skill. The metal giant was sent flying backwards uncontrollably, losing several pieces of armor in the process. Bang! The outer wall separating the main mansion from the rest of the village was noisily smashed as Xietain hit it violently. He couldn't help but cough out a mouthful of blood and his eyes flashed with disbelief. His first-order metal control skill allowed him to control metals almost at will, so he moved the armor with his skill, not his physical body. With this armor, even bullets would not be able to harm him in the slightest, and his total defense was simply terrifying. But even then, the after-effects of the force resulting from the blow was not something his armor could withstand. Much less Xietan's strength, which was greater than that of 20 grown men. This kind of strength was not as simple as 20 grown men hitting the same place with separate forces. All that strength was compressed into his body, and the power behind his fists was simply dreadful. Xietain was about to charge forward, and even with little Luo Ning in his embrace, he was confident of ending his opponent's life easily. However, a magic circle appeared on the ground below him and he hurriedly dashed to the other side just in time. Bang! A large earth stake 2 meters high rose out of nowhere and pierced skyward. If he had taken a fraction of a second longer, the magic earth stake could have pierced his body. Xietain was strong, however, he was different from Xietain, who had faced death countless times after so many clashes against existences more powerful than him. Before Xietain could even stand up completely, Xietan's 201 agility points carried him in a second right over the metal armor. With a gaze as cold as ice, he stomped down with all his might. Boom! The ground caved in, and the metal armor's chest area sank down horribly, unable to withstand the pressure. Inside, Xietain felt his world spun around and began to cough blood uncontrollably at the same time as blood came out of his ears and eyes. I heard that you like to mistreat people just to release your frustration? I also heard that you have abused several women in the same way that your 3 dogs have. The demon's voice rang in his ears, and when he looked up to the sky he saw that Xietain had already jumped more than 5 meters high and was currently pointing at him with his right hand. Let your sins burn. In hell. Xietain sneered, and the blazing ring on his index finger glowed with a crimson shade. Under Xietan's terrified eyes, a blaze of fiery crimson fire flew in his direction at full speed. Even from afar, he could sense death as his passive skill danger sense urged him to flee in a hurry. Unfortunately, the current him had already been mortally injured by Xietan's fierce attacks. His power and his speed and concentration to control his skill had been severely affected as a result. Crimson flames surrounded the 3-meter metal armor completely, and Xietan's howl coming from the flaming giant echoed throughout the village. Standing several meters away on the roof of a 2-story house, Xietain looked at the scene in front of him and listened to the cries and curses of his enemy with indifference. In his cold dark eyes, the crimson flames reflected like the representation of hell on earth, but even then his emotions were not moved in the slightest. The metal began to melt from the magical flames coming from the blazing ring, and even before they reached Xietain inside it, only the heat had begun to burn his skin and deform his body horribly. The feeling of being burned alive was so unbearable that even he, who had been tortured once in the past and had his face cut off, could not bear it. Because activating his metallic control skill required concentration, he could not send the metal armor anywhere else and could only cry out in pain as he writhed all over the ground. The dark starless night, with only the light of the full moon as witness, blazed with crimson flames as the piercing howl of a human became unbearably terrifying, scaring all the survivors who heard it. About a minute later, the flames were completely extinguished and the metal giant had melted into a liquid puddle. As for Qigong, there was no trace of his existence. You have obtained the soul power of Qigong level 22. Blood will, 33%/50%. With his sword at his waist and a little girl sleeping in his embrace, Xietain coldly snorted before walking towards the place. The strongest boss of the four had died just like that, with only 2 strikes from Xietain and the activation of a treasure that made him suffer the horror of hell on earth. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 129 Death of the 4 Big Bosses. This entity called Soul Record really is terrifying. Xietain looked at the 3 objects before him with a complicated look and sighed. Even after the metal armor was turned into a pool of liquid by the crimson flames coming from his blazing ring, and even after an evolved person like Qigong was turned into mortal remains, these 3 treasures still remained intact and resplendent. The 3 treasures were a bracelet, a pendant, and a skill scroll. Because Qigong's soul power was much weaker than his soul power, who had already reached level 35, Xietain did not believe that after killing him he could obtain any loot. However, the 2 accessories were probably belongings that Qigong had obtained throughout his hunts and battles. This was confirmed when Xietain inspected the information on the bracelet and discovered that it was actually a rare-grade treasure earth bracelet, one exactly like the one he had. Because each person could use 2 bracelets and he did not have a different one, he also equipped this bracelet on his opposite hand, which increased his magic by another +10 points. Spiritual Earring, rare grade treasure, when equipped it increases magic and mana by +10. Automatically protects the user from 3 spiritual attacks per day. Current status, March 3rd. Xietain did not have this item, so without hesitation he pierced his left ear and the small earring with a tiny emerald shone on it. Although it was not particularly his taste, becoming powerful was the main thing and he didn't care too much about his appearance anyway. To his surprise, when he saw his reflection on the blade of the sword, he didn't look bad at all. The last item was actually something that surprised and delighted Xietain beyond words, as he always wanted such a skill. Danger Sense, unclassified passive skill, level 5, warns the user by sending nerve signals to the body whenever his/her life is in mortal danger. His eyes glittered and without hesitation, he decided to learn the skill on the scroll for himself. The scroll disappeared from his hands in particles of light that soon entered his body, and deep in his soul, a new rune of yellow color with reddish tones at the edges was formed. With this new skill, his survivability had skyrocketed immensely. While it was true that his broken bronze bell could automatically protect him, the treasure energy was not infinite, and in the event of losing its power, Xietain would have to rely only on himself until he could use it again. Therefore, the passive skill Danger Sense suited him perfectly. Xietain scanned the surroundings before looking at the girl sleeping in his embrace, and a smile slipped onto his lips. If anyone saw him at this moment, they would certainly not be able to associate him with that indifferent face that in less than 5 minutes had claimed the lives of more than 30 people. Unfortunately, there was no one to appreciate it. Du Meng surveyed the scene before him with eyes filled with burning anger that he seemed unable to contain. Along one corridor were 2 corpses whose heads had been blown to pieces. Flesh pulp and blood had stained the white walls with red, and the scared sobs of some kneeling maidservants could be heard clearly amidst the sepulchral silence. Big Brother really is a genius. At the end of the corridor, in front of a wide-open door, Zhongde looked at the slender man across the corridor and smiled. I wonder why no one knew him before all this chaos completely erupted. He continued as if talking to himself. Even without his current strength, his intelligence doesn't lose to President Shangguan's or Chen He's. He should have been able to stand higher on the boards. Du Meng looked at the Desert Eagle in the burly young man's right hand and frowned. That was the only Desert Eagle they had obtained from the police station, and it was one of the most powerful firearms they currently had with a 12.7mm caliber, but now it had fallen into enemy hands. Zhongde suddenly raised the weapon and shot without warning. The sound of the shot echoed through the walls, and the maidservants in the place screamed in fright, but none dared to move for fear of being shot dead. As for Du Meng, he had disappeared as if he had vanished into thin air. Zhongde was startled, and before he could react, he felt his right arm being severed by a sharp object. Hastily, he took a step back, avoiding the cut for the most part, but still being slightly slashed. Blood flowed slowly from the wound, staining the ground and his clothes. Swoosh. 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 The wind howled and Zhongde suffered several bloody wounds. Although he managed to avoid fatal wounds, his arms and some parts of his body had slight cuts from a knife or other sharp object. Du Meng was undoubtedly stronger than him, and in a one-on-one battle, it was impossible for Zhongde to defeat him. However, in this narrow corridor that Zhongde had chosen to fight in, things were different. Bang! 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 Zhongde raised the Desert Eagle and fired 8 times in a row in different directions and completely emptying the magazine. Ugh! From his right side, a groan followed by a bloodstain immediately attracted his attention, and Zhongde, without hesitation, rushed forward, punching with all his strength. Bang! After being injured by a bullet, Du Meng was struck and sent flying before slamming into the opposite wall. His active first-order skill, invisibility, was deactivated, and with a hate-filled expression, he looked at the slowly approaching young man. Bathed in his own blood, Zhongde looked at the bullet hole in Du Meng's abdomen and also noticed that his chest had sunk at an odd angle after receiving his previous fist. If not for the close place, Du Meng would undoubtedly have been the victor. However, after Luo Ning told everything she knew about him, Bai Zemin easily found his fatal weakness, and Zhongde defeated him after some difficulty. With such injuries, it was impossible for Du Meng to survive. Soon after, he coughed up blood along with several pieces of organs and died just like that, with his eyes wide open and filled with unreconciled hatred. Due to the difference in levels, Zhongde went straight up to level 18 and sighed as he leaned against the wall while slowly reloading the weapon in his hands and looked attentively at the maidservants of the place without saying a single word. Although his wounds were not serious, he was certainly losing a lot of blood, so it would be best not to move too much. Soon after, Bai Zemin appeared and chuckled. "Looks like you took a beating, eh?" Zhongde rolled his eyes, but smiled bitterly at the sight of the untouched Bai Zemin. Even with a little girl, he had killed all the enemy militants and had even taken out the strongest Yi Qigong. The difference was simply too great. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 130. New Subclass, Lower Leader. After making sure that the injuries suffered by Zhongde were not serious, Bai Zemin looked at the few kneeling maidservants and said calmly, "All of you need not be so frightened. I don't plan to do anything bad to you in any way. My targets were Yi Qigong, Du Meng, Lei Su, and Yang Pei, the 4 leaders of this camp. Now that they are dead, I will be taking control of the village in their place." The maidservants looked at him with a touch of fear, but his words had managed to calm them down a bit. After all, the previous 4 leaders were not saints and had committed many heinous acts, so even if Bai Zemin did bad things, as long as he didn't kill them, these women would believe it was normal since they had seen such behavior from those in power for a whole week. A voluptuous woman with a slim aura of elegance stood up and while looking at Bai Zemin lowered her head politely. "My name is Qin Ming. May I know the gentleman's name?" "It is Bai Zemin." Bai Zemin replied in a deep voice as he looked at the woman about 9 or 10 years older than him. Not only was her body voluptuous, but her face could be considered a beauty if not for the small burn that had not yet healed at the edge of her lips, but even then, Qin Ming was a beauty in her own right. Before the apocalypse erupted with the appearance of the Soul Record, Qin Ming was a successful businesswoman within Ruiling Subdistrict with assets exceeding 3 million yuan. However, 2 days after the apocalypse, she fell into the hands of Du Meng during a raid on a small village several kilometers away. Because of her natural beauty, Lei Su had wanted to force himself upon her, but she refused and fought until Du Meng stopped him. However, before letting her go, Lei Su had taken it upon himself to brand her with a boiling match, thus damaging her beauty as a warning. After a moment's hesitation, Qin Ming gritted her teeth and decided to bet everything. "Leader Bai, since this will be your new settlement, I think you should gather the survivors to make your rules known." "Oh?" Bai Zemin looked at her with a tinge of surprise in his eyes, but quickly understood what she meant. Not only was it necessary to change the name of this camp, but it was also necessary to make his face known among the survivors. In addition, Xietain also needed to recruit men to arm them properly and start delegating tasks. Xietain smiled and nodded in satisfaction. Qin Ming, from today you will be my housekeeper. Gather the maidservants and the women of the leaders. Then take them to Yi Qigong's villa, it will be my new home. Qin Ming was elated at the new position and quickly nodded hurriedly before looking at the rest of the women who looked at her enviously and began to give orders. Because of her previous job, it was easy for her to guide and take the role of a small leader, so soon all the women began to move in an orderly fashion. Shangguan Bing Shui and the rest drove the buses, the big Dongfeng truck, and the various pickup trucks through the camp. The male and female students as well as the teachers had looks of amazement as they looked at the more than 700 survivors standing around the well-lit central square. Amazing! Wu Yijuan exclaimed as she looked at the corpses of the militants. He alone really managed to fight and kill so many gunmen. Shangguan Bing Shui's beautiful eyes also had a strange glint in them as she looked at the scene. She had faced a group of just over a dozen men armed with machine guns and rifles, so she knew that even with her constant evolution it was not simple to defeat an armed squad. However, Xietain had managed to wipe out more than 30 by himself. The reason for her surprise stemmed from the fact that he did not possess a skill like her first-order ice maker, capable of defending and attacking at the same time. At least, she had not seen him use one. However, after remembering the magic treasure, broken bronze bell, it all made sense. After the students disembarked the buses, they were ordered to stand up with the rest of the village survivors, so they all had no choice but to stand in the midst of people who were clearly not in a good situation. It was only then that several of them realized that from today on, their lives could take as big a turn as when the soul record showed up unannounced. Many even regretted it, but it was too late. Standing on a small stage made of wood, Xietain looked at the 1,000+ people with an indifferent gaze. However, only he knew that he was not really calm at all. A step behind him, Lily watched the scene with a small smile as if she was having a lot of fun. Now do you understand why I wanted you to conquer as many places as you can? Xietain heard the succubus' seductive voice in his head like the devil's whisper. Xietain looked at her out of the corner of his eye and took a deep breath as he read the messages flashing in his retina. The number of living beings under your command have exceeded 1,000. You can now choose the lower leader subclass. Subclass. Xietan's main class was currently Blood Berserker, and while it was true that this would change once he reached the second order, the rest of his classes would remain somewhat similar to the current one but stronger. However, a subclass was something he hadn't expected since Lilith had never mentioned it to him. A subclass was something that helped role-playing video game players to get some extra power without interfering with the main class or the player's goals. Although generally a subclass was a lot weaker than the main class, the extra help was always good because if two beings with a class of the same type faced each other, the one with a better subclass would be the victor in the end. Xietain did not hesitate and accepted the lower leader subclass right away. You have successfully acquired the lower leader subclass. A leader is one who leads his/her followers to success and victory. You still have a long way to go towards the path of a true king. Lower leader, increase the total power by 1% and another 0.1% for every 1,000 people under your rule. You have the ability to name 2 people loyal follower. Those who become your loyal follower will never be able to betray you and in life and death situations will be able to use 5% of your overall strength. To evolve to the next tier, you need to have 10,000 people under your rule. Xietain did his best to stay calm as he knew he was currently being watched by more than 1,000 people. However, it was extremely difficult for him to do this as this new subclass had opened up a world of possibilities for him.